The Kondar Military Academy floated in geosynchronous orbit above Rexia Prime, a monument to martial excellence that had been churning out competent soldiers for approximately 4,000 standard cycles. Which was impressive, really, if you enjoyed the sort of thing that involved getting punched in various appendages by professionals who had dedicated their entire existence to perfecting the art of organized violence. The station itself was a masterwork of architectural intimidation, all sharp angles, reinforced bulkheads, and the kind of lighting that made everyone look either dangerous or desperately in need of sleep. The Academy accepted recruits from 12 different systems, each species bringing their own unique approach to the timeless tradition of hitting things until those things stopped being problems. The Vrexians, naturally, ran the place. They had 6 arms apiece, stood roughly 9 feet tall when they bothered to straighten their spines, and possessed the kind of casual physical dominance that made other species feel like they had shown up to a gunfight with strongly worded letter. The combat training protocols at Kondar were considered the galactic standard, which meant they were simultaneously the most respected and the most dreaded certification a soldier could earn. Graduates wore their Kondar marks with the kind of pride usually reserved for people who had survived things they probably should not have. The instructors were legendary. The facilities were state-of-the-art. The medical wing was, coincidentally, also state-of-the-art and saw considerably more traffic than anyone liked to admit in the promotional materials. At the center of this organized chaos stood Instructor Thexvalon, a Vrexian who had been breaking recruits and their spirits for the past 2 centuries. He had the traditional 6 arms, each corded with muscle, that looked like it had been carved from granite by someone who was angry about something. His carapace bore the scars of 3 separate wars, 2 assassination attempts, and 1 incident involving a diplomatic reception that had gone spectacularly wrong. He did not talk about that last one much, but it had made him marginally famous in certain military circles. Thexvalon had trained warriors from every major species in the known regions. He had taught Kelf cavalry officers how to maximize their quadrupedal advantages. He had shown Bronthan shock troopers the finer points of using their considerable mass as a weapon. He had even, gods help him, managed to instill some semblance of discipline into a class of shard warriors, which was roughly equivalent to teaching water to flow uphill through sheer force of personality. Humans, in his extensive experience, were fine. Just fine. They made adequate engineers when properly supervised. Their diplomatic corps was functional, if somewhat prone to emotional decision-making. Physically, they were, well, there, present, existing in space and time. They had 2 arms instead of 6, stood at a height that Thexvalon found vaguely amusing, and generally possessed the kind of build that suggested their evolution had involved significantly less mortal combat than most species. The Academy had trained humans before, of course. They tended to be decent tacticians, possessed of a strange creativity that occasionally bordered on concerning, and showed adequate competence in weapons training. But hand-to-hand combat, that was where human limitations became rather obvious. They lacked the raw strength of a Bronthan, the speed of a Kelf, the reach of a Vrexian. They were, in the grand scheme of galactic martial prowess, thoroughly middle of the pack. Which was why Thexvalon had experienced a moment of profound internal amusement when he reviewed the incoming class roster and discovered that not only was there a human enrolling, but she was the only human in a cohort of 30 recruits. The last human trainee had been 3 decades ago, a fellow named Rodriguez, who had been perfectly adequate and entirely forgettable. Thexvalon had to check his files to even remember the man's name. This new recruit was listed as Maya Chen, age 24 standard years, previously employed as a civilian freight coordinator on some backwater orbital station that Thexvalon had never heard of and would likely never visit. Her entrance examination scores were passing but unremarkable. Her physical assessment numbers were, charitably, mediocre. She stood 5 feet and 6 inches tall, weighed approximately 140 pounds, and had the kind of slim build that suggested her most strenuous regular activity involved walking to the cafeteria. When she arrived at the academy via the weekly transport shuttle, Thexvalon observed her from the upper viewing gallery as the new recruits assembled in the main training bay. She was easy to spot among the others, not because she stood out, but because she very much did not. While the Kelf recruit pranced nervously on four legs, while the Bronthan loomed like a mobile boulder, while the Shard warrior refracted light in unsettling patterns, the human simply stood there with her duffel bag and an expression of polite attention. She had dark hair pulled back in a simple tail, brown eyes that tracked everything with what might have been curiosity or might have been mild anxiety, and the kind of face that would disappear in a crowd of three. Her uniform fit properly, but without distinction. She did not fidget. She did not posture. She simply existed in her designated space, like a particularly unimpressive piece of furniture. Perfect, Thex Valen thought with satisfaction. This would be educational for her certainly. A bit of proper military discipline would serve her well when she inevitably washed out and returned to whatever mundane civilian occupation awaited her. He had seen 1,000 recruits like her, species notwithstanding. The ones who thought they wanted to be soldiers, until they discovered what being a soldier actually entailed. The first week was assessment week, which was academy terminology for find out exactly how inadequate you are before we begin the long process of making you slightly less inadequate. The recruits were put through a battery of tests designed to measure everything from reaction time to pain tolerance to the ever-popular "how long can you run before you start making noises" that concern the medical staff. Maya Chen failed spectacularly at almost everything. The strength trials were particularly brutal. The test involved lifting progressively heavier weight bars until failure. The Bronthan recruit, a massive individual named Korax, who looked like evolution had specifically designed him to move boulders, managed to lift approximately 1,200 pounds before reaching his limit. The assembled recruits made appropriate impressed noises. Even Thex Valen nodded, with something approaching approval. The Kelf managed 600 pounds, which was impressive, given her quadrupedal frame was optimized for speed rather than raw power. The Shard warrior, whose crystalline structure was as much mineral as organic, hit 800 pounds and stopped not because of muscle failure, but because she claimed the bar was unpleasantly warm against her palms. When Maya's turn came, she approached the weight bar with the kind of expression normally associated with people facing minor dental work. She managed to lift 220 pounds, then failed at 240. She stepped back from the bar, nodded politely to the testing administrator, and moved to the side without complaint or excuse. Thex Valen watched this performance with growing satisfaction. 220 pounds, that was barely above the minimum threshold for academy admission. Several of his arms crossed over his chest in an unconscious gesture of vindication. The reflex tests were no better. Recruits stood in a marked circle, while automated systems fired non-lethal projectiles from random angles. The goal was to dodge or deflect as many as possible in a 60-second period. Korax, despite his size, managed to avoid 17 out of 25, which was respectable. The Kelf, unsurprisingly, dodged 22 with the kind of fluid grace that made it look easy. Maya managed 9 dodges out of 25 attempts. The projectiles hit her in the shoulder, the hip, the thigh, the ribs. She took each impact with a small grunt and a grimace, but kept moving, kept trying. When the 60 seconds ended, she had bruises forming in real time across her arms and torso. The medical scanner flagged her for observation, but nothing requiring immediate intervention. Endurance testing involved running on a track while wearing a 40-pound weight vest. Most recruits made it 15 laps before voluntary cessation. The Kelf made it 23 laps, because of course she did. The Bronthan made it 11, which was actually impressive given his mass. Maya made it 16 laps. 16 laps of looking like she was personally contemplating every life choice that had led her to this moment. Her face turned an alarming shade of red. Her breathing sounded like a malfunctioning air recycler. When she finally stopped, she bent over with her hands on her knees and remained in that position for approximately 3 minutes, while her cardiovascular system presumably filed a formal complaint. By the end of assessment week, the class rankings were posted. Maya Chen sat at position 27 out of 30 recruits. The only individuals below her were a Shard warrior who had sustained a training injury on day 2, a Kelf who was dealing with some kind of inner ear infection that destroyed his balance, and a Vrexian recruit who was, frankly, a disgrace to the species and would probably wash out before week 3. Thexvalen reviewed the rankings with the grim satisfaction of someone whose expectations had been thoroughly met. The human was exactly as mediocre as predicted. She would struggle through the program, learn a few useful skills, and eventually return to civilian life with a certificate of completion and some interesting stories. This was fine. Not everyone could be a warrior. The galaxy needed freight coordinators too. Week 2 brought the beginning of actual combat training, and this was where Thexvalen truly excelled. Teaching recruits how to fight was not merely his profession but his calling, his art form, his reason for existing in a universe that often seemed specifically designed to disappoint him. He approached each lesson with the kind of intensity that made recruits question their life choices and their insurance coverage. The lesson of the day was striking fundamentals. Basic, essential, the foundation of all hand-to-hand combat. Thexvalen stood at the center of the training floor, 6 arms spread wide, his voice carrying across the bay with the kind of projection that came from 2 centuries of yelling at inadequate students. "Combat begins with the strike," he announced, which was the kind of obvious statement that nonetheless needed saying because recruits were often idiots. Your appendages, properly utilized, become weapons. Your body becomes a weapon. The strike is not merely about force, though force is important. It is about technique, precision, the efficient transfer of kinetic energy into your opponent. He gestured to the training dummy positioned beside him. It was a reinforced composite model, rated to withstand impacts up to military-grade combat levels. The Academy had commissioned them specially after a previous model had proven insufficiently durable. These newer versions could take a beating from virtually any species and remain functional. "Probably. Observe," Thexvalen said, and demonstrated a proper Vrexian strike. He used 3 of his 6 arms in sequence, each blow landing with precisely calculated force against the dummy's torso. The impacts produced sharp crack sounds that echoed through the bay. The dummy rocked backward on its base, the composite surface showing minor stress marks where his fists had connected. Technique, control, power, these are your priorities. He stepped back and gestured for the recruits to form a line. You will each demonstrate a basic strike. I will observe. I will correct. You will learn, or you will fail, or possibly both simultaneously. The demonstrations began. Korax approached first, and his strike against the dummy was like watching a small meteor impact. The entire apparatus shifted backwards several inches. Thexvalen nodded approvingly and provided minor corrections about hip rotation. The Kelf went next. Her strike was swift and sharp, optimized for speed rather than raw power, still effective, still worthy of minimal praise. One by one, the recruits took their turns. Thexvalen provided commentary, correction, and occasionally outright mockery when someone's technique was particularly offensive to his professional sensibilities. The Shard Warrior's crystalline structure made for interesting striking angles. A Vrexian recruit from one of the outer colonies showed promise. A thick-skinned Margith demonstrated that even species without traditional fists could adapt the principles. Then came Maya Chen's turn. She approached the training dummy with the same quiet demeanor she had maintained for 2 weeks. No swagger, no hesitation, just a simple walk from the line to the striking position. She examined the dummy for a moment, looked at Thexvalen as if checking whether there were additional instructions, then set her feet in a basic stance. Thexvalen watched with the kind of attention one gives to an experiment with a predictable outcome. The human would strike the dummy, the impact would be underwhelming, he would provide his standard lecture about human limitations, and they would move on. This was the natural order of things. Maya pulled back her right fist, rotated her hips in a motion that was technically correct if unimpressive, and struck the dummy's center mass. The impact produced a sound like someone dropping a small book on a table, a tiny, sad, thoroughly inadequate sound. The dummy rocked backward approximately 1 inch, maybe 2 inches, if one was feeling generous. The composite surface showed absolutely no stress marking whatsoever. For a moment, the training bay was silent, except for the ambient hum of life support systems. Then Thexvalon laughed. It was not a cruel laugh, precisely, though it certainly was not kind. It was the laugh of a professional who had just witnessed something so predictably mediocre that it had achieved a kind of perfection in its inadequacy. Several of his arms gestured expressively as he approached Maya, his voice carrying that particular tone instructors use when they are about to deliver a lesson wrapped in humiliation. That, he said, still chuckling, was the single weakest strike I have observed in approximately 15 cycles of instruction. Possibly longer. I would need to check my records to be certain, but I am reasonably confident that a strong wind produces more impact than what you just demonstrated. A few of the other recruits made sounds that might have been suppressed laughter. Korax's massive shoulders shook slightly. Even the injured Shard warrior seemed amused, which was impressive given that Shards did not technically have faces. Thexvalon continued his lecture, warming to the theme. This is why humans struggle in martial disciplines. Your species lacks the basic physical infrastructure for effective combat. 2 arms instead of 6. Minimal muscle density. Fragile skeletal structure. You are, and I say this with professional objectivity, rather than malice, poorly designed for violence. Maya stood there and took the lecture with the kind of patient expression that suggested she had heard similar speeches before. Her hands remained at her sides. Her breathing stayed even. She did not argue, did not make excuses, did not display any of the defensive reactions that Thexvalon had learned to expect from recruits whose inadequacy had been publicly noted. In a real combat scenario, Thexvalon said, gesturing with 4 arms while the other 2 remained crossed, an opponent would barely register that impact. You might as well be throwing. What is that human expression? Angry words. Harsh language. You would be more effective simply insulting your enemy and hoping they die of embarrassment. More suppressed laughter from the assembled recruits. Thexvalon was rather proud of that line. He would have to remember it for future inadequate human students. Then Maya spoke, her voice quiet but clear enough to carry across the now attentive training bay. Can I try again? Thexvalon's laughter died into something that might have been surprise or might have been further amusement. Try again, he repeated, as if testing the words for hidden meaning. You wish to demonstrate your inadequacy a second time for the benefit of the class. I'd like to adjust my technique, Maya said, which was technically a reasonable request but delivered in a tone that gave Thexvalon a strange feeling somewhere in his primary nervous cluster. If that's acceptable. This was unexpected. Recruits who had just been thoroughly mocked typically wanted to disappear, not volunteer for additional scrutiny. Thexvalon considered the request for approximately 3 seconds, then gestured magnanimously with several arms. By all means, he said, his voice taking on a theatrical quality that suggested he was about to provide entertainment for the class. Please, demonstrate your adjusted technique. We are all eager to observe this miraculous improvement. He stepped back and gestured to the other recruits. Watch closely. Perhaps we are about to witness the kind of marginal enhancement that comes from determination and wishful thinking. Maya did not react to the mockery. She simply turned back to the training dummy, which stood there in its reinforced composite glory, completely unmarked by her previous attempt. She took a breath, a slow, deliberate breath that involved her entire torso. Then she adjusted her stance. The adjustment was subtle, a slight widening of her feet, a minor change in her center of gravity. Her shoulders rolled back fractionally, and something in her posture shifted in a way that Thexvalon could not quite identify, but which triggered a small warning sensation in his hindbrain. Maya pulled back her right fist again. The motion was similar to before but somehow more deliberate, more committed, as if the previous punch had been a question and this one was the answer. Then she struck. The sound was not a book dropping on a table. The sound was a thunderclap in an enclosed space, a sharp explosive crack that made every recruit in the bay flinch simultaneously. The training dummy did not rock backward 1 inch. The training dummy's entire torso compressed inward as the composite material failed catastrophically along multiple stress points. The dummy shot backward off its base mounting, traveled approximately 15 feet through the air in defiance of its considerable mass, and collided with a reinforced wall behind it, which was rated to withstand direct weapons fire, which had been standing solid and unmarked for 4,000 cycles, which now had a crater in it roughly 3 feet in diameter. The dummy clattered to the floor, its chest cavity compressed to approximately 1/3 of its original depth, composite fragments scattered across the training bay floor like confused shrapnel. Small pieces continued to fall from the wall crater, making tiny clicking sounds that seemed unnaturally loud in the absolute silence that had descended upon the assembly. Every single recruit was frozen in place, their various appendages and sensory organs locked onto the fluss and scene of destruction with the kind of attention usually reserved for natural disasters or ship breaches. Korax's mouth hung open far enough that his secondary teeth were visible. The Kelf had risen onto her hind legs in an instinctive threat posture. The Shard warrior was refracting light in patterns that indicated severe distress. Maya lowered her fist slowly and turned to face Thexvalon. Her expression had not changed. She was not smiling or gloating or displaying any emotion that would indicate she had just performed the physical equivalent of a war crime against Academy property. She simply looked at him with polite attention and asked, "Was that better?" Thexvalon's brain had temporarily stopped processing information. All 6 of his arms had gone rigid. His tertiary heart was beating at approximately twice its normal rate. The warning sensation in his hindbrain had evolved into a full-blown alarm that was suggesting he reconsiders several fundamental assumptions about reality. "What?" he said, and his voice had lost all its theatrical confidence. "In the name of every god across 12 systems, was that?" Maya looked at her hand, flexed her fingers experimentally, then looked back at Thexvalon. "That was me actually trying," she said, as if this explained anything at all. The training bay remained frozen. Somewhere, a door chime sounded as the automated emergency alert registered structural damage. Thexvalon heard the sound from very far away, as if it were happening in another dimension where things made sense. "Explain," he said, which was less an instruction and more a desperate plea for information that would restore order to his understanding of the universe. Maya shrugged, a gesture that looked far more ominous now than it had 5 minutes ago. The first punch was normal. Regular output. How I'd throw a punch in, like a bar fight or something. And the second? Thexvalon asked, though part of him did not want to know the answer. "I turned off the limiters," Maya said, as if this were a perfectly reasonable sentence that normal species said about their bodies. Before Thexvalon could formulate a response to that deeply concerning statement, the training bay doors opened and Medical Officer Krill hustled in with the kind of speed that indicated the automated systems had flagged this as a significant incident. Krill was a Margeth, small and stout with sensory stalks that were currently waving in agitation. "What happened?" Krill demanded, medical scanner already active and sweeping the bay. The damage alerts registered an impact consistent with military-grade explosives. "Is anyone injured? Do we have a structural breach?" "We have a human," Thexvalon said, which was accurate if not particularly informative. Krill's sensory stalks swiveled to focus on Maya, who gave a small wave that absolutely no one appreciated. The medical officer approached her with the scanner extended, ran a full-spectrum analysis, then stopped and stared at the readout with an expression that Margaths made when they were fundamentally confused. "I need you to come to medical," Krill said to Maya. "Right now, immediately. Do not argue, or I will have you sedated and carried." "Am I in trouble?" Maya asked. "You destroyed a training dummy and part of a wall," Thexvalon pointed out, finding his voice again. "So yes, probably. I'm more concerned about her physiology," Krill said, still staring at the scanner. "Because according to this, she should not be capable of what apparently just occurred. Which means either my scanner is malfunctioning, or I need to significantly update my understanding of human biology." 20 minutes later, half the training cohort and Thexvalon were crammed into the medical bay observation room while Krill ran every diagnostic scan in the Academy's considerable database. Maya sat on an examination platform, looking mildly uncomfortable with the attention while machines beeped and hummed around her. Krill finally looked up from the display console, sensory stalks drooping in what might have been exhaustion or existential dismay. "I have good news and deeply disturbing news," the medical officer announced. "Start with disturbing," Thexvalon said, because he felt he had earned it. "Human musculature is capable of producing approximately 8 to 10 times their normal strength output," Krill said, and waited for this information to sink in. It did not sink in so much as crash into the assembled observers like a cargo shuttle with failed braking thrusters. 10 times, Korax repeated slowly, his massive brow furrowing. 10 times normal output? The human nervous system has built-in inhibitors, Krill continued, pulling up a holographic display of human anatomy that looked disturbingly familiar yet suddenly alien. Limiters in the motor cortex that restrict muscle activation to approximately 10 to 15% of maximum capacity during normal voluntary movement. Why in the name of reason would a species evolve with limiters on their own strength? The Kelf recruit asked, all 4 legs shifting nervously. "Self-preservation," Krill said. "Human skeletal structure and connective tissue are relatively fragile compared to most species. If they operated at full strength capacity regularly, they would tear their own muscles, snap their tendons, fracture their bones. The limiters protect them from themselves." Thexvalon felt several of his heart's skip beats. "You are telling me that humans walk around with the capacity for enormous strength, but their own biology prevents them from accessing it. Under normal circumstances?" "Yes," Krill confirmed. "However, the limiters can be voluntarily suppressed in high-stress situations. The human brain can, with training or in cases of extreme emergency, bypass the safety protocols. They call it hysterical strength. There are documented cases of humans lifting vehicles to save trapped individuals, breaking through reinforced doors, performing feats that should be biomechanically impossible. They can just turn off their safety limiters." The Shard warrior's voice was pitched higher than usual. "Voluntarily. With training, apparently, yes." Krill gestured to Maya, who gave another small wave that everyone now found deeply unsettling. "This individual has clearly learned how to access that capacity at will, which is, and I cannot stress this enough, absolutely insane from a medical perspective." "What happens when she does this?" Thexvalon asked, dreading the answer. Krill pulled up another display showing microscopic damage to muscle tissue. Microtears throughout the muscle fibers. Stress to the connective tissue. Significant metabolic cost. She'll be sore for several days, and will need increased caloric intake to repair the damage. If she did this repeatedly without recovery time, she would cause serious injury. "So she hurt herself to punch the dummy?" Korax asked. "She hurt herself to destroy the dummy and part of a reinforced wall," Krill corrected. "And based on her baseline physiology, she knew she would hurt herself and did it anyway." There was a long silence in the observation room as this information settled over the assembled individuals like radioactive fallout. "That is horrifying," the Kelf finally said, speaking for everyone. "That is humans," Krill replied with a wave of sensory stalks. "They evolved on a death world where everything was trying to kill them, so their solution was to evolve the ability to temporarily become strong enough to kill things back, even if it meant damaging themselves in the process. It is the most aggressively survival-oriented biology I have ever encountered." Thexvalon looked through the observation window at Maya, who was now being released from the scanner with instructions about rest and nutrition. She looked the same as she had 2 hours ago, small, unimpressive, thoroughly average, except now, he knew that appearance was a lie. Or rather, it was the truth only because she was actively choosing to be weak. Every human he had ever trained had been operating under those same limiters. Every mediocre performance, every average score, every unremarkable assessment had been because they were biologically prevented from accessing their full capacity. And none of them had mentioned this, because apparently walking around as deliberately weakened versions of themselves was just normal for humans. The information spread through Kondar Academy like a virus with excellent marketing. By the next day, everyone knew about the human who had destroyed Academy property by turning off her biology. The story grew with each retelling, as stories do, until some versions had her punching through 3 walls and causing structural alerts across entire sections. The training cohort treated Maya with a mixture of respect and profound unease. Korax, who had been casually superior about his strength advantage, now gave her a wide berth and made polite conversation that had the distinct flavor of talking to an armed explosive. The Kelf recruit asked careful questions about human combat training, clearly recalculating every assumption she had made. The Shard warrior simply stayed on the opposite side of the room whenever possible. Maya, for her part, seemed genuinely confused by the reaction. "It's not that big a deal," she told Thex Valon during a private meeting in his office, where he had summoned her to discuss the incident and also to reassess his entire understanding of human physiology. "You destroyed Academy property rated to withstand military ordnance," Thex Valon said, keeping his voice level with considerable effort. "I got excited," Maya said. "You laughed at me. So you committed what amounts to structural violence against a wall because I insulted your weak punch." "It wasn't weak the second time," Maya pointed out with infuriating reasonableness. Thex Valon rubbed his face with 2 hands while the other 4 remained crossed. "Why did you throw a weak punch the first time? Why not simply demonstrate your actual capacity?" Maya looked at him like he had asked why she did not simply walk around on fire. "Because that's normal? You don't just go around at full capacity. That's how you hurt yourself and break things." "Which I did, obviously, which kind of proves the point." "Let me understand this correctly," Thex Valon said slowly. "Every human in the galaxy is walking around at approximately 10% of their actual strength capacity because accessing the other 90% causes self-damage. More like 10 to 15%. But yeah, basically. And none of you mention this, because it's just normal? Do you go around explaining your entire biology to everyone you meet?" Maya asked. "I assumed you knew. Humans have been in the galactic community for like 200 years. Thex Valon realized with growing horror that she had a point. He had trained dozens of humans over the decades and never bothered to research the specifics of their biology beyond basic medical requirements. He had simply assumed that their mediocre performance represented their actual capacity rather than a fraction of their capacity constrained by internal safety systems. "Are all humans capable of this?" he asked. "Of turning off the limiters? I mean, kind of. Anyone can do it in a real emergency. Training helps you do it on purpose, without waiting for your brain to panic. I took some classes before coming here. Classes in voluntarily damaging yourself. Classes in combat application of human physiology," Maya corrected. "Though yeah. The instructor did mention that we should probably mention the whole limiter thing to non-human trainers, because apparently it causes incidents." "Incidents," Thex Valon repeated flatly. "Is that what we are calling the complete destruction of a training dummy and partial destruction of a wall? An incident? I mean, yeah." Maya shrugged. "Could have been worse. I didn't punch another recruit." The horrifying thing was that she seemed to genuinely believe this was a reasonable perspective. Over the following weeks, Thex Valon found himself completely recalibrating his training approach, not just for Maya but for every human recruit who would come after. He requisitioned research on human biology, studied medical files he should have read decades ago, and discovered a litany of information that made him question how humans had survived long enough to develop space travel. Humans could hold their breath for extended periods by triggering a diving reflex that slowed their heart rate. Humans could continue functioning with damage that would incapacitate most species due to adrenaline response. Humans could adapt to extreme temperatures, survive on minimal nutrition, and apparently just decide to ignore pain under the right circumstances. They were not the strongest species, or the fastest, or the most resilient by any single metric. But they had the most backup systems, the most override protocols, the most emergency responses hardwired into their biology. They were a species that had evolved every possible trick to survive just one more day, and they carried all of those tricks into the wider galaxy like barely contained weapons. Maya completed the training program ranked 7th in her cohort. Not because she suddenly became superhuman in every assessment, but because once Thex Valon understood her actual capacity, he could train her properly. The strength trials became about control rather than maximum output. The combat sessions became about technique and when to access full capacity versus when to maintain the limiters. She never destroyed another piece of Academy property, though there was a close call during advanced sparring when she forgot to keep her limiters active and nearly put Korax through a bulkhead. The massive Bronthan, to his credit, took it well and later admitted that the experience had taught him valuable humility. When graduation came, Maya received her certification with minimal fanfare. She shook Thexvalen's hands, all 6 of them in sequence, and thanked him for the training with the same quiet demeanor she had maintained throughout the program. "You never told me why you joined," Thexvalen said as she prepared to leave. "What makes a freight coordinator decide to become a soldier?" Maya considered the question for a moment. "Freight coordination was fine," she said, "but it was boring. I wanted to do something that mattered. Make a difference, maybe. And nearly destroying my training facility was part of that plan." She smiled, which was somehow more unsettling now than it had been at the start. That was just making a point. The difference comes later. Thexvalen watched her leave the academy and wondered, not for the first time, what humanity was going to do now that they were spreading across the galaxy. A species that walked around deliberately weakened, capable of enormous violence but choosing restraint, until the moment they chose otherwise. The Academy quietly updated its protocols for human recruits. Training dummies were reinforced to higher specifications. Walls were checked for stress tolerance. Medical staff received additional briefings on human biology and the various terrifying ways it could override its own safety systems. And Thexvalen, veteran of 2 centuries of martial instruction, made a personal note that would go into his permanent files and be passed to his eventual successor. Never, under any circumstances, laugh at a human's weak punch, because that weak punch is them being polite, and you do not want to see what happens when they stop being polite. The galaxy continued turning, species continued interacting, and somewhere in the vast darkness between stars, humans continued being exactly what they had always been. Not the strongest or the fastest or the most dangerous by any single measure. Just the species that had learned how to be weak on purpose, which implied a capacity for strength that everyone else was only beginning to understand. The universe had dealt them a mediocre hand of physical attributes, and they had responded by installing limiters on their own biology so they would not break themselves or everything around them. Which was, Thexvalen reflected as he reviewed the repair bills for the training bay wall, either the most sensible thing he had ever heard or the most insane.